Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we dig into some compelling sources and, well, pull out the key insights for you.
Hopefully help make sense of things a little better.
Exactly. So today, we're taking on a really fascinating topic, migration, but looking at it through the Old Testament.
Yeah, our source material for this is Ned Holter's work. My father was a migrant Aramean, specifically excerpts focusing on Old Testament motifs for a theology of migration.
And what's immediately striking, I think, is how relevant these, ancient texts feel to today's world, especially around migration.
Absolutely. It's kind of a reminder that people moving across the globe, it's not new, not at all. It's baked right into the Old Testament stories.
Right. So our mission, our goal for this deep dive is really twofold. First, looking at how migrants themselves, historically and more recently, have read the Old Testament in light of their own experiences.
And second, we want to identify the key migration themes, the motifs, within the Old Testament text itself.
Yeah, hopefully by the end you'll have a richer sense of migration, not just as a modern issue, but as this, long thread running through human history.
Okay, so where do we start? Let's look at how migrants have actually, interacted with these texts. Holter makes a fascinating point that this starts inside the Old Testament.
That's right. It's not just later people looking back. He points to Isaiah, for example, the way Isaiah describes Judah coming back from Babylon.
Yeah.
It uses language and imagery that really echoes the Exodus story. It's like they were seeing their own return through the lens of that original liberation story.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
so they're finding parallels in their own time.
Exactly. And Amos does something similar, drawing a parallel between the Israelites leaving Egypt and the Philistines migrating, the Arameans migrating.
So it wasn't just seen as an us thing. It was like migration is something lots of people do.
Kind of suggests as a broader understanding, yeah, like movement is just part of the human condition.
Okay, so fast forward a bit. Holter talks about two really big waves of migration in more recent centuries and how the Bible played a role. The first one is that period of European colonial migration. And tragically, that happened alongside the forced migration of the West African slave trade.
Yeah, that's a really tough juxtaposition. So you have these European migrants, they're coming from societies where the Bible is, pretty central.
Right. Very familiar with it.
So it's natural they'd use it to try and understand these new places, these new peoples they were encountering.
And how did that play out?
Well, Holter mentions they'd interpret indigenous groups through things like the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, sometimes making connections that seem pretty stretched now, like identifying groups in southern Africa as, descendants of ancient Near Eastern peoples.
Trying to fit them into their known world, basically.
Yeah.
But what about their own experience? Did the Bible speak to that?
Oh, hugely. Especially the Exodus and conquest story. That motif was powerful.
I can imagine. Fleeing persecution, looking for a promised land.
Exactly. For religious groups escaping Europe and heading to North America, that narrative of deliverance from oppression, finding a new home, it must have resonated incredibly strongly. They saw themselves in the Israelites leaving Egypt.
Right. But that interpretation also had a darker side, didn't it? Holter brings up the Boers in southern Africa.
He does. During their great trek away from British rule, they also adopted this Exodus conquest framework.
Seeing themselves as the chosen people.
Yeah, and the land they were entering as their promised land, and, the people already living there, unfortunately, got cast as the Canaanites.
Oof, yeah, that really shows how interpretation isn't neutral. It has real-world consequences.
Definitely. And Holter makes a key distinction here, right, between these European migrations, which were often driven by hardship, but still largely voluntary.
Compared to involuntary or forced migration.
Right. Like he mentions convicts being shipped off to Australia. For
Yeah.
them, maybe the story of being expelled from paradise offered some way to make sense of it.
A very different kind of meaning-making.
Totally different. And then, of course, the ultimate forced migration, the slave trade.
Yeah. Millions forced from Africa to the Americas. It's almost hard to comprehend.
But what's so powerful, and Holter highlights this, is how African Americans took hold of the Old Testament.
Despite everything.
They found echoes of their own enslavement, their own deep longing for freedom in those stories of Israel and Egypt.
Yeah. Through spirituals, stories, sermons. They weren't just reading the text, they were living it, interpreting it through their own suffering and hope.
Absolutely. And those interpretations became incredibly powerful, spreading hope and resilience really globally.
So that's the first major wave. What about the second one Holter identifies?
Okay, so this is the post-colonial period. Think roughly 1960s onwards. It's kind of a reverse migration.
Reverse, how so?
people moving from formerly colonized areas back towards the West, towards the former colonial powers.
Oh, okay. I see. And this is driven by different things.
Yeah, it's complex. Holter acknowledges it includes both voluntary aspects, maybe seeking economic opportunity, and involuntary ones, like fleeing war, ethnic conflict, even human trafficking. The push-pull factors idea is maybe useful here.
Right. And Holter points out something interesting, doesn't he? He calls it an irony of fate.
He does. The idea that many of these migrants, particularly from places like sub-Saharan Africa, might actually be more familiar with the Old Testament than people in the West, where societies have become more secular.
Exactly. So what's that like? You arrive, maybe as a committed Christian, in a place where religion seems less central.
That must be quite a shock, culturally and religiously.
For sure. Holter touches on this and then dives into a couple of really specific examples, like Frieder Ludwig's work.
Ah, yes, on the Liberian Christian community in Minnesota. He uses the Joseph story, right?
Yeah, Genesis 37:50. It's fascinating. Apparently, back in the 19th century, African Americans who wanted to return to Liberia saw parallels in Joseph.
And then much later, Liberian immigrants coming to the U.S. in the late 20th century, they also found meaning in Joseph's story, being, thrust into difficult circumstances.
But ultimately being able to help their family back home.
Exactly. Whether it was about physically going back or sending financial, intellectual, maybe ethical support from afar, they saw a kind of divine purpose in their displacement, just like Joseph.
Wow, that's a powerful narrative to connect with. And the other example,
Kenneth Matada's study, he looks at African diaspora Christianity in the West more broadly.
and he uses that line from Psalm 137.
Yeah, that heartbreaking question, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? It really gets at that feeling of dissonance, doesn't it?
It really does. Cultural religious dissonance. What kind of things does he point to?
Well, things like different expectations around worship, prayer styles, how long a service should be, how sermons are delivered.
Practical things, too.
Yeah. Yeah, he mentions a sense sometimes that Western churches might offer less maybe spiritual and practical support compared to what people were used to in African contexts.
Interesting. And differences in how the Bible itself is read.
Right. Matada notes that sometimes there's a preference for more literal interpretation among African Christians, which can sometimes, rub up against the more critical approaches common in some Western theological circles.
Okay, so that gives us a really good sense of how different groups of migrants have engaged with these texts over time. Now let's flip it.
Right. Let's look inside the Old Testament itself. Holter argues migration isn't just incidental, it's like a core theme.
Absolutely. I mean, just think about the big stories. Abraham leaving home, heading off into the unknown.
Israel spending generations in Egypt.
The exile in Babylon. It's all about movement, displacement, journeys.
Yeah. And Holter really zeroes in on one specific passage as key, the historical credo in Deuteronomy 26.
Ah, right. Verses 5 to 9. It's like a mini creed, summing up Israel's identity.
Exactly. Do you want to read it? It's powerful.
Sure. It says, "My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, subjecting us to harsh labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey."
So much in there. Okay, let's unpack it. First part. My father was a wandering Aramean. That's not the ancestors, right?
Right. Jacob, specifically. It connects him immediately to that whole era of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, described in Genesis 12 to 50. They're constantly moving.
Even though God promises them land, they're basically nomads or semi-nomads.
Exactly. And their interactions along the way with Philistines, Canaanite cities, figures like Melchizedek, Holter, suggest these have this kind of intertextual link to later parts of Israel's history. It keeps raising the question of what it means to actually live permanently in the Promised Land.
And the word used for Jacob in Egypt, it's the verb ger, to sojourn, which connects to the noun ger.
Yes, the ger, often translated sojourner, resident alien, maybe protected foreigner. It's a really significant category.
And the Old Testament talks a lot about the gerger, doesn't it? How they should be treated.
It does. consistently. The Gurg is often mentioned alongside the orphan and the widow as someone vulnerable who requires protection and justice.
So it's like a recognized social status, not just someone passing through.
Right. The law explicitly protects the Gurger. Deuteronomy says you need to judge fairly between citizens and the Gur living among them. They're included in community celebrations. They get a share of the tithe.
Okay.
And Deuteronomy 10 makes it crystal clear. God loves the Gurger, provides for them, and the Israelites must love the Gurger too.
Because they were Jerem themselves in Egypt.
Exactly. It's central to their identity.
Yeah.
It creates this tension, this dual perspective on the Promised Land. It's a gift, yes, but their identity is also shaped by having been landless foreigners.
Wow. And then Jeremiah takes it even further.
Yeah, portraying God himself as a sojourner. That's kind of the ultimate statement about the significance of this identity.
Okay, so that's the ancestor migration. What's the next big theme in the Credo?
Well, the Exodus conquest, obviously.
Yeah.
It's right there. Mistreatment in Egypt, crying out to God, the dramatic rescue with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm.
And then receiving the land flowing with milk and honey.
It's the foundational story. Now, it's interesting. Egypt isn't always negative in the Old Testament. Sometimes it's remembered as a place of refuge during famine.
Right, like for Jacob's family initially.
But the overwhelming image is negative. Land of slavery, the iron-spelting furnace,
Yeah.
and the Exodus motif. It's everywhere. Narratives, psalms, laws.
Even the Ten Commandments start with it, right? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt.
Precisely. It frames the whole relationship. And notice, even the Sabbath law includes the Gerager.
Mm-hmm. In both versions, though the reasons given are slightly different.
Right. Exodus links it to creation, but Deuteronomy links it directly back to their slavery in Egypt, so that your male and female servant may rest, as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. It ties rest and liberation together, even for the foreigner.
That's powerful. Now, this Exodus story is very focused on Israel, God's chosen people. Does it ever get broadened out?
Mostly it is particularistic, yeah, but there are these hints of something wider, like Exodus 19, where Israel is called to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation,
Right.
maybe implying a role among other nations.
Okay.
And then you have that really striking verse in Amos 9.7, where God basically says, okay, Israel, I brought you out of Egypt, but didn't I also bring the Philistines from Caphtor and the Arameans from Kir?
Wow. So God's involved in other people's migrations too.
That's what Amos seems to be saying there. It's a pretty unique, universal application of the Exodus idea. God's not just Israel's mover. He's involved in the movements of nations.
Okay, so we have the ancestors, the Exodus. What's the third lens Holter brings to the Credo? It's not explicitly in the text.
Right, but it's the interpretive context.
Ah.
The Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC.
So the idea is that much of the Old Testament was edited or written down during or after the exile.
And that experience of being forcibly removed from the land inevitably shaped how they read their own history, including this credo.
How so? How does exile change the reading?
Well, think about the references to Abraham and Jacob in the later parts of Isaiah during the exilic period. They're held up as figures of hope. Abraham, who also came from Mesopotamia, from Ur, his journey becomes a kind of parallel for the exiles hoping to return. Jacob, the ancestor who is a migrant Aramean.
Their stories resonate in a new way for people who are also displaced.
Exactly, and even the Exodus story gets reread. Isaiah 52 talks about leaving Babylon, but not in haste, like they left Egypt. God will go before them and be their rear guard.
So it's the same theme of divine deliverance, but adapted to the new circumstances.
Precisely. So reading the Credo through that exilic lens, it stops being just a history lesson. It becomes intensely personal, intensely communal for the exiles and those returning. The we in the Credo, we cried out, the Lord brought us. It suddenly includes Abraham, the Exodus generation, and the generation in Babylon. It connects all these experiences of migration under God's faithfulness.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so this brings us to Holter's final point, really. Thinking about the Old Testament and what it offers for a theology of migration today.
Yeah, he notes there's growing interest in using biblical text to think theologically about migration. And he stresses that theology always happens in that meeting place between, well, text and experience.
Right, the ancient words and our modern lives. So what perspectives emerge from that encounter, according to Holter?
He outlines a few. First, a textual one. The Old Testament itself models how to interpret migration. Israel's own story, read through the exile, becomes a way to understand displacement. And even our modern migration categories, voluntary, involuntary, push-pull, you can see echoes of those dynamics in the biblical stories.
Okay. Then an anthropological perspective.
Focusing on that figure of the farer, the sojourner. That experience of being without permanent roots becomes a key part of Israel's identity. It's both a reality they lived and an ethical command. Remember, you are Jurim, so treat the Gera well.
It defines who they are and how they should act.
Exactly. Then there's a theological perspective. The God of the Old Testament isn't tied to one place. Yahweh travels with his people. And as Amos suggests, God's concern extends beyond Israel to other migrating peoples too.
The God of migrants, in a sense.
In a very real sense. And finally, an ethical perspective. This is crucial. Holter acknowledges that historically, migrants have sometimes misused these texts.
Like the colonial examples we discussed.
Right. Using the Bible to justify actions that harmed others. So there's a huge ethical responsibility on anyone interpreting these texts today to think about the consequences.
That's a really important caution.
Definitely. But the overall point is that the Old Testament offers this incredibly rich set of stories, motifs, and theological ideas about migration that still have so much to say to us.
Especially maybe as the church increasingly sees migration as part of its global reality and mission.
Precisely. Holter thinks the Old Testament has huge potential for building a contemporary theology of migration that's focused on, well, liberation and justice. Emancipation, he calls it.
So wrapping up this deep dive then, it seems clear migration isn't just a theme in the Old Testament, it's maybe the theme or one of the absolutely central ones.
Yeah, from personal journeys to national movements, from historical memory to theological reflection. And migrants themselves have constantly found their own stories reflected in these ancient words.
And that figure of the clodger, the sojourner, is just fundamental to Israel's identity and to God's own character and commands. Which leaves us and you with maybe a final thought to chew on. If migration is this ancient, deeply woven thread in the human story, and if these texts hold such enduring insights, how should that change how we think about belonging, about community, in a world that seems more mobile than ever?
What responsibility does that place on us towards those who are in so many different ways, the sojourners, the Jerem, in our own communities today?
Something to reflect on. We definitely encourage you to think more about these themes, maybe check out Holter's work if you get the chance.